So I thought I'd start out our time this morning together sharing something with you that I have learned about myself, but it's taken several years, and I don't know if I fully learned the lesson. I was a minister at a church up in North Carolina for a while, and they had a massive baptistry. It was beautiful, but there was one problem. It was always empty. And I told them, I said, if we are the Christian church, if we're going to teach the importance of baptism, then we should probably have the baptistry actually full. To which they said, well, the problem is we have to have somebody clean it. We have to have somebody maintain it. And I said, look, that's not a problem. I'll take care of it. I will be the one to do that. And so I volunteered to do it. And what that required is that at least once a month, I was cleaning it, scrubbing out the sides, and then refilling it and making sure the chemicals were balanced and everything. Well, one day I decided it was time to do that, so I started filling it. Now, the process takes about 45 minutes to an hour just to get this thing full. And it actually took a little bit longer than that some days. I don't know why, but sometimes it would just take a little bit longer. So I started that out, and I thought, you know what? I can do something while I'm doing this. I can get caught up on some phone calls. Well, the sanctuary was in one part of the building, and then over about where our fellowship hall is here was where my office was. And I thought, I'm going to go over there, get some phone calls done, and then I'll check back on this and get it ready to go. So I went over, I made my phone calls, and one of the phone calls that I made in particular was to a mentor of mine. And the mentor spent some time just kind of talking to me. He had been the minister at this church, and he was saying, how's it going? How are you dealing with things? And I'm just kind of talking for a while for him. And I thought, you know what? It's probably about time for me to go back over. And I'm still on the phone with him, and I make it to the back doors of the sanctuary. And there is a scripture that says, let the floodgates of heaven open. And the floodgates had intentionally opened in our sanctuary. And I looked, and at the front of the sanctuary was literally a waterfall coming over the top. I did not know there were not overflow drains on this baptistry. It is literally pouring over like a waterfall. And I did two things simultaneously. I started to run down the aisle, and forgetting that my mentor was on the phone, I said some words that you're probably not supposed to say in the church or on the phone with a spiritual mentor. And, I just kind of threw the phone, I hung up, I got everything turned off, and I thought, okay, it's not that bad. It's not that bad, as one does. I'm looking around, I go, okay, I've got the water off, I can get all of this sopped up. Maybe nobody will notice. We had like a rug doctor. I was like, I can get all this water sucked up and just get the fans and the blowers going, and it'll be good. Now, mind you, it's all the way down the stage. It was unreasonable, but in my head, I thought maybe I can get away with this and nobody will ever know. Well, then, right at that moment, it hits me. I'm on the top story of a 2-story church. That water has to go somewhere. So then I run downstairs, and the floodgates of heaven have opened again. And it's coming down from the drop ceiling. It's running down the walls. It's running by the electrical panel. So I run over and I at least flip off the electrical panel. And I just think this is it. This is what I get fired for. How do you move on to another church after flooding one church? And I had to come to the realization I've got to call my elder. And I called my elder. Now, my chairman of my board at that time, he was a former prison guard. So you can imagine how excited I am to make this phone call that I have flooded the sanctuary. And I decided to call him, and all he does is he walks in, and he's at the back of the sanctuary, and he just shakes his hands with both hands in his pocket, and he says, "Boy, you did a number on this one, didn't you?" Whoo! I was so relieved. That's all I heard. I started apologizing profusely. I thought, oh, this is it. I'm going to get fired. I understand. It's fine if you want to fire me. I'm going to tell you what, that is the most grace-filled man I have ever met when it comes to accidents, because he simply looked at me and said, "It's why we have insurance." And he said, "Now that I think about it, we never did baptize the sanctuary, so now it's ordained." So anyway, it all got cleaned up, but I learned something on that day that I still struggle with. And I thought maybe it would get better as I had big life lessons like that. And that is, I am really bad to multitask. I'm really bad to try to do two things at once. And the problem is, anytime I do that, I tend to only do so good. Maybe I get by, but it's not as good as it could be, or I completely ruin it. I mean, I do it with all kinds of things, like cooking. If I start cooking and then walking away, working on something else, then I'll forget that. Or I start on one project, I don't get it complete all the way. And I had a professor at Milligan, a professor of psychology, who told me that multitasking is a myth. That your brain just rapidly switches between two things. It's just kind of a word we've made up to say that we're doing multiple things. But I think that's probably true, but I did learn last night that multitasking is possible for ladies. My wife was simultaneously watching the Bible recap, painting her toenails, and eating Belgian chocolate waffles. I didn't know that was possible. But I mean, she did it at some level. But for the rest of us, and maybe you join me when I say this, multitasking isn't really a thing. We convince ourselves that we can do two things at once, but honestly, most of the time, it either fails or it's not as good as it could be, because our mind, our focus is shifting between two things so rapidly, it's hard to keep everything in focus, and it's hard to prioritize what you started out doing. And that's a difficult thing. So I'm willing to bet there's some of us here that have dealt with that, or maybe even struggle with it now. And as we look at this story that we've been following, the story of Moses, we find a time when Moses struggled with this as well. We've been looking at the life of Moses since the time he became what we call an underdog. He moved from the top of the social and power structure really to the bottom of both of those things. But along the way in Moses' story, we have seen God call Moses to one thing after another. And last week, what we left him off with was Moses being called to be a prophet and thinking that he wasn't good enough, and understanding what it was that God had called him to, and he made excuse after excuse. But after God called him to be a prophet, Moses answers that call. He finally answers it. God gives him all the gifts, and we know the rest of that story. I mean, even if we haven't grown up in church, we probably know the story of the Exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt. They move through the Red Sea, they go into the deserts. But it's in the midst of this time period, during this time, when things have shifted for Moses. Now, when the Israelites leave Egypt, when you leave a structure, whether it's good or bad, you start looking for a new type of structure, whether organizationally or otherwise. For instance, in Egypt, they may have been at the bottom, but they knew what they could do, what they couldn't do. People were making decisions for them. They knew how everything worked. But then, when you're out in the desert, who's answering the questions? Who's making the decisions? Who feeds all of these people? You have to understand, at some point, we naturally look for that as a people. We look for some kind of structure. And in the same way, Moses had to answer that call. So now Moses, who has been a prophet, who has just led these people out of Egypt, now transitions to a new position. He now becomes a leader. Now, this isn't what Moses specifically got called to. God didn't say, hey, I want you to lead, and you're going to be in this leading position. He said, I'm going to have you lead them out, but he didn't say it was going to be kind of as a king or instructions or decisions. This wasn't something Moses was necessarily looking for, but it happened naturally. And Moses finds himself actually in two different roles. Maybe roles he didn't think he would ever get to. He was leading people that he thought he would never lead. And maybe some of us are doing that. And you may be sitting here this morning and you think, I don't lead people. Who do I possibly lead? The truth is, we all lead someone, don't we? Whether you know it or not, you are leading someone. By sitting here this morning, you're leading someone. Most likely, someone is watching you. Someone is listening to you. If nothing else, maybe it's somebody in your family. Maybe your kids are looking up to you. Maybe a cousin or an aunt or uncle is watching what you're doing. Maybe you lead in your job. Maybe you don't know people are following your example. Maybe it's in your social settings. Well, I'll go out and do this if they go out and do this. We all lead someone whether we want to or not. But the question is, how do we lead? Well, in the midst of Moses leading these people, he finds himself making decisions. In fact, he's sitting as a judge. He's settling arguments. He's deciding what will be next and how things will be organized and who will be fed. And in the midst of doing all of that, his father-in-law comes to see him. His father-in-law comes to see him. His father-in-law, Jethro, comes out into the desert, and he finds Moses and the Israelites out in the desert. And as he looks around, things look like they're going well, that God has done some big things. But Jethro notices something. Moses is doing two things at once. Two things that God didn't design him to do and that he wasn't supposed to fulfill. Day and night, Moses is deciding for the Israelites. He's judging, he's settling disputes, and he's deciding what's next. Well, in our text today, Jethro addresses this. Whether intentionally or not, he knew this was not good for Moses. And so if you've got your Bibles today, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 18. This is where we find the story of Moses in the desert. And while he's leading and making these decisions, Jethro is watching what he is doing. And in Exodus chapter 18, all the way down in verses 17 through 18, Jethro begins to address these two different things happening at one time. This is what it says. Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you are doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourself out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." So Jethro sees that God has done some amazing things. He sees that this God, Yahweh, has actually delivered the Israelites, Moses' people, out of bondage. And he sees this as a great thing. And right before this conversation, we see that Jethro is so pleased and so amazed at who God is that he goes up with the elders and he offers a sacrifice. And he sees God as the one who has been directing and leading them the whole time. He has been showing them where they need to go. But when he gets to Moses, he notices that Moses is trying to take over God's job. Maybe not on purpose, it's just a rhythm he's fallen into. He's not following what God has been doing at some level. And this is how we know. Now, I would be willing to bet Jethro doesn't know this illustration, but there's an illustration that's been used for years with leadership and business, whether from church standpoint or otherwise, and it's this picture, and maybe you've seen it before. If you look, you will see two very similar pictures. On the top, you have what's called the driver. And some people refer to both of these people as leaders. But the top is the picture of the driver. Now, who is the driver? The driver is someone who looks in front of the people and knows what's ahead. Maybe they know that things could be rough, or if one decision is made wrong, maybe they need to go this way. That driver is literally looking at all the possibilities, trying to point the people in a direction. And that's an important job. But it takes someone who can see all of those things that are ahead and know what could possibly happen. But then if you look similarly at the picture below, you will notice that that same figure has moved to the front of the people and is leading. Now, what's the difference between a driver and a leader? A leader, in this case, is someone who sets the example of where they are to go. The driver decides where they will go, but the leader sets the direction by example. In other words, understanding where the driver wants to steer the ship. And they lead by example by carrying out those things, hoping that others will follow their lead. Now, these are two separate roles, but if you look at what Moses is doing, he's doing both. There's a big problem here, and this is why Jethro has a problem with what Moses is doing and why he says, you're going to get worn out. You're doing both things at the same time. And I'm sure Jethro is a little bit confused. He's probably confused because he's seen what God can do. He knows that God can deliver the people. He knows that he has already given them direction. If you follow the story of the Exodus, by day they were guided by a cloud, by night it was a pillar of fire. He's taken them through the Red Sea. The question has to be, Moses, why are you directing where the people are going when God is already doing that? And so Jethro says, if you continue to do both of these things, you're going to wear yourself out. It's not what you were intended to do, to be both the driver and the example, the leader in what you do. And I want to stop right here because this is where some of us find ourselves. Some of us find ourselves in a place where we think it's best that we carve out our own direction, that we know where to go, that we know how to live our life or how to steer our family. And the truth is, we were called, just like Moses, to be leaders in our lives, but we weren't called to be the drivers. It's interesting that so often we try to drive and lead our families and friends and our workers in the same direction that we're going. And the problem is, I don't know about you, but I've made a lot of mistakes when I've gone my own direction. Even with my kids, I try to tell them what I think is best for them. And how many mistakes have I made in my life that yet I'm still trying to lead them in the same way that messed me up? Often we tend to want to direct our life. And it's not easy. It's not easy to let go of that role because we think we see what's ahead. God, I can see my finances. I know how much I'm paying for groceries. You don't. You're not here with me. I know what's best for this season of my life. Maybe it's, I know what's best for my career, or I know what's best for where I'm going to go next. I know what's best for who I'm going to marry or where I'm going to go to school. I appreciate, God, that you're there, but this is my life. And a lot of us still want to be the driver, and then we want to try to lead ourselves and lead others in the same direction that often leads to failure. There is only one driver. The driver is someone who can see all the possibilities, know all the problems, and know what's ahead. And the only person that can do that, the only being that can do that is God. God is the only one that can know all the outcomes, that can know what road is ahead. He knows what hardships you're going to run into. Even if you follow His direction, there will still be hardships. But He also knows how to navigate those things. He also knows how your life can turn out to the best possible example, the best possible outcome. But a lot of us aren't allowing Him to drive. We want to drive. And we want to lead. And we go through life and we're exhausted. And we're frustrated. And when things don't turn out, who do we look to? God, why did you allow this to happen? God's saying, hey, you never let me drive the boat. You never let me give you direction. And even if I do, you don't listen. Isn't it interesting how quick we fall into the role of Moses and we find ourselves exhausted and frustrated? What Jethro wants Moses to see here is that he was called to be a leader, not a driver. And a leader gives an example. And if you look at the life of Jethro and the short stories we get about him, we see that he recognizes who God is and the capability of God. And in fact, in Deuteronomy, God says that in this exact moment that Jethro is retelling right here, that he was a part of that he orchestrated what happened next. You see, what he says is, you need to call new leaders. Jethro says you need to call others, and you need to put them over 25s, 50s, over 100s, over 200s of people, and let them be the ones to make the decisions. Let this be a leading together. Let all of you be an example, and let God direct the path of the people. And God calls those people out to help Moses lead. In the book of Deuteronomy, we see reference to this story. Now, as a result, the example that Moses is supposed to set is one that says, I'm following God's lead, so follow me. If we go back to our picture for just a second, that's exactly what that looks like. As the leader, you follow God's example, and if you follow God's example, the hope is that others will follow you as you follow the example of God. And that's a lot easier to do when they know who's driving. It's a lot easier for people to follow you if they know that you're trusting God. And Jethro wants Moses to see that. That he was meant to be the leader, but he wasn't meant to be the driver. But let's say that in our own life, we recognize that we're trying to do both. And maybe our life has become a little bit of a mess, or we've had some bumps along the way when we've tried to steer the ship. My question is, what does it change to let God be the driver? What really changes? Does anything change? Or is it just a good thought or a good saying as Christians? What would actually change in our life? If you follow along in Exodus chapter 18 and you go down to verse 23, go to verse 23 with me for just a second, you'll notice that Jethro points out exactly what will happen if Moses will allow God to be the driver. And line for line, this is what he says. If you do this, God will direct you. You will be able to endure, and all this people also will go to their place in peace. There are three key things that Jethro points out to Moses that will happen if he will let God direct and he will simply lead. And the first thing happens in this, he says, if you do this, God will direct you. Say direct you, church. Direct you. One more time. Direct you. I want you to hear that word come out of your mouth because a lot of us still want to direct ourselves. What does it look like for God to direct us? Me, you. What does that look like? In your life, God is going to be the one who is always able to see what's ahead. So the directing is pretty simple. There's not a lot to go into here. The direction is that when we listen to God, then we are able to know the course we should take, the decisions we should make. But there's one key thing to all of this. You've got to be willing to listen to God. You've got to be willing to hear what God has to say. And a lot of times when we interact with God, it's telling God what's on our plate, what we want Him to fix. But we don't spend a lot of time listening. We don't listen to what He's saying. And there's a couple of ways that we can listen. Number one, we can listen through Scripture. He gives us a manual to deal with a lot of the things that He wants to direct in our life and the way we handle different difficult situations. But we've got to spend time in it. We've got to spend time listening to it. Recently, I heard someone quote Mother Teresa, who had been interviewed by Dan Rather. And Dan Rather asked her, when you pray to God, what do you say? And she said, I don't say anything. I listen. I don't say anything. I listen. Dan Rather was kind of taken aback for a minute, and then all of a sudden he says, well, wait a minute. When you talk to God and you listen, what does God say? And she said, He doesn't say anything. We just listen. Isn't it interesting that in our own prayer life, we don't take time to make space for God, to simply listen to what He has to say to us, to sit in His presence, and then we go through life from one thing to another in the chaos of rushing, and we're wondering why life's falling apart, but we're never listening to anything He has to say. But He wants to direct us. But if we will allow Him to do that, He will direct us, if we give Him the space to do that. The second thing that Jethro points out that will take place is you will be able to endure. Now, this one's really important because if you notice, he's had the conversation with Moses and he said, you're going to be exhausted. You're basically going to be overworked and you're not going to be able to do this. So how does God help us to endure? God already knows the pace we should be moving at. In fact, He's laid out the pace for us for centuries. If you think about it, He always talks about the Sabbath when He's talking about what's best for His people, a time of rest. God knew that His people were meant to rest, but we're not very good at it, are we? In fact, in the busyness of life, what have we done? We've just made Sundays or Saturdays, we've just made them another work day, haven't we? Another day to get things done. How often do we sit and have a Sabbath? And what does a Sabbath look like? It looks like simply being in the presence of God. Spending time with God. Now, someone will say, well, I've got a Sabbath every Saturday. I sit and I watch Netflix all day. That's not a Sabbath. That's not time with God. Are you resting? Maybe. Maybe your body is. Maybe your mind is at some level, but you're not resting with God. And God designed that for us. But we have increasingly become busier and busier. We want information faster. We want things more efficient. And you know what that's led us to? An overwhelming number of people struggling with anxiety because we don't know what to do when things actually stop. That's what it creates a lot of anxiety, is when things sit still or things sit quiet, we go, wait a minute, this isn't normal. What's getting ready to happen? What's happening next? It's because we don't know how to rest, but God knows the pace we're supposed to move. But we live in a culture that says if you sit still, if you don't do anything, you're being what, church? Say it louder. You're being lazy. And some of us were raised that way, and some of us have been told that all our lives. And heaven forbid we sit still in the presence of God when our Savior did that very thing. Jesus went out many times and sat in the wilderness by himself. Elijah did, Moses did, Abraham did. Do you think there's something we could learn from the pace that God set for their life? If they had to do it? Maybe let's stop saying we're lazy when we're spending time in the presence of God. It also reminds me, when I think about the pace that's set for us, is that sometimes we do need to be driven. And sometimes we're supposed to be pushed. I'm sure there were times when Moses had to be pushed in the desert. I recently watched, not too long ago, a documentary on the Iditarod race, the dog races. If you've ever watched that, it's really interesting. They talk about the driver, and what's interesting about the driver is he knows the pace his dogs are supposed to take as they run this long race. And the thing about the sled dogs is they are powerful and they will keep moving, but there's a problem. Because they keep moving, if the driver gets off and he's not tethered to the sled, do you know what they'll do? They will keep going. And they will run and they will run and they will run because they think the driver's still having them go. They trust the driver to stop them. And actually, they will go so long that the lead dog or whatever dog is still going will drag the rest when they start to die, when they start to collapse. They will keep moving until they all collapse because that's what they think they're supposed to do. But the driver knows the dogs. The sled racer knows the dogs, and he knows when they need to stop, when they need to rest, but he also knows when they've got to push, when they've got to move through a certain area before a storm hits or before things get really bad. In the same way, God knows the pace you were designed for. And there are times in your life where he's going to tell you, you need to rest. We need to be together. You need to rest. But there are also going to be times that he says, hey, this is a storm coming in your life. You got to push through. You got to keep moving. In the same way, Jethro knew that there was a pace to be set for Moses, and that's how Moses would endure if he let God set the pace, not him. Because day and night, it says Moses was judging the people, and he was getting exhausted. The last thing that it talks about is they will go to their place in peace. So does this mean if God's driving our lives, that if he's setting the direction, that everybody's just going to be peaceful and get along and we're not going to have any problems? No, even Moses faced problems. In fact, he has a rebellion on his hand, and a couple of chapters later, even though he's following what God says, the people start to rebel against him. So does this mean there won't be any conflict? No. What Jethro's talking about in this case is that the people were also exhausted and frustrated because they were waiting for decisions and judgments to be made, and they weren't being made. Because it was one man making all of those things. When Jethro calls him to call other leaders to set the example of following God, then more problems could be dealt with. So they could go away feeling that they had peace to their resolution to what they needed. That's what they were hunting for. And he says, hey, they're going to find that. But what does that look like in our life? Because it doesn't transition quite the same way. In our life, when we allow God to be the director, people can find peace in following us. It is a lot easier for your family, for your friends, for your coworkers to be able to trust your decisions if they know you are doing so in a way that aligns with God. If your family knows that every decision you make is prayerfully considered, that they know that the direction you head in is prayerfully considered, that they have seen time and time again where you have lived out the life that Christ has called you to, they are willing to trust you. Now, I usually ask for permission in advance, so I'm going to go ahead and apologize. When I use somebody as an illustration that I see this happening in their life, I usually ask, so I apologize in advance. But I recently heard a story of somebody who their family was able to follow their lead even though everything was falling apart, and they were able to trust God. And it was evident in the way that they reacted. Recently, Tanner and Kelly Boyd went on a trip. And they're laughing because if you have ever seen like the worst possible vacation movie ever where everything falls apart, that's exactly what happened on their vacation. They headed out for the beach and it was literally one thing. I don't even have time to get into everything that went wrong. But let me just say that one of the big things that happened after tires going flat, after air conditioning's going out, after trailers falling apart, and one of the big things that happened is they're going down the road and all of a sudden they hear a loud thud, and behind their trailer for at least a couple of miles from what they described was an electric bike that was well worth it. Let me just say that. Very expensive. And by the time they got stopped, the handlebars were tore down. It was nothing but just a piece of metal. And you would think that was bad enough, but at their next rest stop they got out, relaxed, got everything regained, and Tanner had kept his composure. He was calm, apparently. Now, that's the story I'm getting. Kelly may tell you something different, but that's the story I got. He kept his composure. He was calm, but here's what happened. They stop at the rest stop. They're like kind of catching their breath, and they're relaxing. They get back in the truck, and they pull out on the highway, and they look over to their right, and they go, "Hey, that dog looks a lot like our dog." Sure enough, their dog was running down the highway. It had jumped out while they were at the rest stop. And not just one dog. They said, "Turn around and see if the other dog's there." No, the other dog's gone too. So now they're chasing after two dogs. And that was just the beginning of one thing after another. But one thing I heard from Kelly was that Tanner always kept a good attitude. I got to tell you, I lost it after the first thing they said happened. I'm already turning the car around. Now that may seem small and it's a funny story, but don't you think Tanner's kids were looking at the way he reacts? Don't you think his wife was looking at the way he reacts? We may think we're not leading anybody, but the example of who we claim to follow is preached in our life, whether we want to or not. And it is a lot easier for people to follow your lead, no matter your situation or where you're leading, when they know that you're following the one who leads us all. Paul says in his writings, "Follow me as I follow the example of Christ." Believe it or not, Christ said, "Follow me as I'm following the example of God, as the one who directs." It's easier for people to have peace in their life when they know who you're following. It's easier for them to follow you. These are three things that Jethro says will happen for Moses. And if you look at the rest of the life of Moses, it begins to happen. We see all of these things fall into place, that God was orchestrating all of those things. And maybe the voice of Jethro was exactly what Moses needed to hear when he was trying to do two things at once. So the question I want to leave you with this morning, as we look about what we are called into, the role that you are called to be the example, not the driver, to be the leader for your family or your friends. The question is, what role or roles are you trying to fulfill? What role or roles are you trying to fulfill? All of us lead someone, and how we lead, people will watch. But when we lead, if we try to do both things, if we try to figure out the direction and get it all right, I have a feeling we're going to end up exhausted and frustrated. Usually I have 3 questions for you. I don't have 3 questions this week because I think all of us need to answer this question. Whose role are you following? What role are you fulfilling? Are you the leader or are you trying to be the driver? Each of us needs to sit in that and understand what we are called to if we are going to be the best example of a leader to those around us. I also want to leave you with an equation. It's a pretty simple equation. If he is the driver, his path plus our obedience equals others' breakthrough. The peace that people find is often exactly what they're looking for when they follow a leader. the opportunity to break through exactly whatever they're struggling with. And they might be looking to your example and how you follow Christ to know what's next. If you can remember that equation, His path plus your obedience equals others' breakthrough, then we can see lives changed, not just ours, but those around us.